the 26th, 1788, when the first European settlers arrived here in Sydney Cove, it was the middle of summer. The convicts and their keepers sweltered under the hot Pacific sun.
They observed that the Aborigines had developed their own way of keeping cool, but didn't choose to emulate their ways. Back in England, their king, George III, led a craze for sea bathing among his wealthy subjects. In the Antipodes, this custom caught on among the soldiers sent to maintain order in this distant outpost of European civilization.
The inhabitants of that part of Darling Harbour in the rear of the military barracks complained loudly of the soldiers bathing all along the shore in that direction at all hours of the day. In consequence of which violation of common decency, their wives and daughters are reduced to the alternative of remaining constant prisoners in their own houses or having their feelings outraged.
Sydney begins as a penal colony with the kind of strict regulations that you'd expect in a penal colony. But the government of the day wasn't really all that worried about some aspects of life, and in fact, soldiers would quite often go nude bathing in the harbour. But with the influx of free settlers from the 1820s in particular, pressure grew for the government to sort of clean up what was really a fragile moral tone in this new community. And by 1833, the governor of the day has decided that they're going to ban daylight bathing in Sydney Harbour.
And it shall be further enacted that it shall not be lawful for any person to bathe in any part of Sydney Cove or near any public wharf or quay in Darling Harbour between the hours of 6 in the morning and 8 in the evening.
A couple of our clever entrepreneurs quickly hit on the idea that they ought to develop private baths, which is exactly what they did right here in the Domain.
Mrs. Esther Biggs opened baths here exclusively for women, and nearby, the barber, Mr. Henry Robinson, opened his famous bathing machine.
Bathing in public banned during daylight hours, Australian beaches became favoured spots for picnicking, promenading and paddling.
There was no thought of swimming as people promenaded in their Sunday best.
Pollution levels in the centre of cities then were actually very, very high. I mean, scientific knowledge about pollution was pretty feeble. Our cities weren't properly sewered until the late 19th century. So a hell of a lot of the inner city areas, particularly the working class slum areas, really did stink. And the way to escape them in Sydney was to hop on the ferry at Manly, and as the phrase goes, it's 7 miles from Sydney, 1,000 miles from Care. You take in the sea breezes on the ferry coming over, you promenade up and down the Corso, have a picnic on or near the beach.
While their parents promenaded, children were allowed to remove their shoes and stockings and paddle in the foam.
From the 1860s, Australia saw the development of beachside resorts rather along the English model. Even our resorts ended up with English names like Brighton in Melbourne, Sandgate in Brisbane. Here at Manly there's a hotel called the New Brighton. But of course daylight bathing was banned. It was okay for kids to paddle. And so what happened was these resorts had to develop all sorts of facilities, piers, all kinds of games, just to keep people occupied.
Luna parks with hell-mouth entrances were built at St Kilda near Melbourne and Glenelg near Adelaide. St Kilda developed into a popular seaside resort with music halls, palais de danse, cafes, tea pavilions and shooting galleries, while resorts in other parts of Australia had their aquariums, water chutes and the inevitable Big Dipper.
Bathing was allowed before 7 a.m, provided bathers covered their bodies with next-to-knee costumes.
The law banning daylight bathing was extended to cover all public waterways and beaches in the new colonies spread around the Australian coastline. But fashion magazines of the day continued to promote a wide range of bathing attire for women, inspired by sailors' uniforms. These were worn in ladies' baths or for the early morning seaside dip, and there was even a rust-proof corset to enable women to maintain the fashionable pouter pigeon look.
The Archbishop had a heart attack when he saw Boy George kissing a fella in this week's People magazine.
British colonies and became an independent nation. With a new nation and a new century, some citizens began questioning the heritage of colonialism.
One of these was William Gocher, editor of the Manly and North Sydney News. He campaigned against the outmoded laws that forbade daylight bathing, and in 1902 defied the law on Manly Beach.
So anyway, Dad got out after he enjoyed his surf, and then he wrote it up, why didn't they arrest him? He said, I'll be there 11 o'clock next Sunday until you arrest me. So they took him off, and he had to go before the court. So he said that Mr. Thosby, I think was the Chamber Magistrate, he said, I've been reading with interest about you, Mr. Gocher, and he said, I know that you've won the day. So he said, that's right. So he said, you can go home now and bathe all day if you want to.
Oh, the sea, the glorious sea, ever cooing and calling to me.
The effects were slow at first, but beach bathing eventually became the most popular sport of the new nation.
There's a place called Home Sweet Home by the sea, the glorious sea.
About 5 years later, when the population increased and the business people were doing well, they decided that they'd commemorate the occasion for William Gocher by presenting him with a gold watch inscribed for his actions. They'd double the population in the place, the fact that the shopkeepers were doing well and the residentials were, the holiday people were coming down, that sort of thing.
Oh, golden, golden sands of Manly shore and white surf rolling free, where beauty dwells forevermore.
Property owners who had once protested at the invasion of their beaches now subdivided their fallow farmlands and sold them for holiday homes and suburban real estate as daylight bathing became a national craze.
M-A-N-L-Y, Manly, M-A-N-L-Y, sweet Manly, Manly by the sea.
The newfound popularity of the beach meant big business for the fashion industry. During the 19th century, men had frequently swum nude in private baths or else worn V's, a curious form of athletic support not unlike today's racing brief. For family occasions at the beach, they donned woolen neck-to-knee costumes, though they popped their V's over the top. An extraordinary custom, for it must have drawn attention to the very part of the anatomy that prudish Victorians would have been least enthusiastic about revealing. Women's costumes were even more elaborate. With up to 10 metres of fabric, they were cumbersome when dry, but when wet, positively treacherous. Post-Federation, an extremely large busted look became all the rage. Swimwear followed this line, giving women the appearance of something like a puffed-up cockatoo. Accessories included rubber-lined bathing caps, an unfortunately durable accessory which has remained with us to this day. The knee-length costumes, often sporting sailor collars, were made of stockinette or sateen. With them, stockings were worn and also laced-up shoes right into the water.
In the early 1900s, more and more local councils are allowing daylight bathing, but rather in the tradition of the baths of the 19th century, they're still insisting on segregated bathing so that men and women are still on one side and the other side of the beach. This time, a lot of local councils start to employ beach inspectors. It's a notion of sort of policing life on the beach, if you like. A number of bathers decided that they'd reject the notion of segregated bathing, but if you were going to go in for mixed bathing, you of course had to choose some of the more secluded beaches around Sydney. One of Sydney's smaller and not particularly well-known beach was Clovelly here, which was really just bushland and damn hard to get to, and mixed bathing was quite common here.
Eventually accepted on Sydney beaches, it was vigorously opposed in Melbourne, where a prominent clergyman proclaimed,
"No modest man can be associated with mixed bathing, and no man who respects the opposite sex can take part in it."
but civil disobedience eventually won out, and mixed bathing was accepted throughout Australia.
One of Australia's first fashion contributions to the world was made in Boston, USA. In 1907, Annette Kellerman was arrested for daring to appear in a naughty one-piece swimsuit.
Annette felt that one of the great things that had to be done was the liberation of the body into sensible costumes and clothing, and hence in 1907 she was wearing a fairly modern type of one-piece bathing costume.
Kellerman was an Australian swimming champion whose aquatic prowess earned her a Hollywood contract. Dubbed the $1 Million Mermaid, she starred in such movies as Neptune's Daughter and toured the world with her underwater ballet displays. A fervent propagandist for physical fitness and healthy diets, Kellerman's greatest contribution, however, was in the improvements that were made to women's swimwear.
Despite the controversy it had caused, the Kellerman one-piece soon became accepted fashion. While still decidedly neck to knee, it did dare to bare the arms and legs. It not only allowed for a certain welcome freedom while swimming, it was a portent of more radical changes to come.
By the second decade of this century, surf bathing became a popular pastime for families. This led to more demands for beach regulation.
In 1912, the New South Wales Government Surf Bathing Committee issued its recommendations.
We are of the opinion that sunbathing, as it is called, or lying on the open beach clad in bathing costume, should not be permitted. We think the practice of persons in bathing costumes mixing with the general public on the beach who are not bathing is objectionable. Every person clad in bathing costume shall, on leaving any dressing enclosure or shed, proceed by the nearest route to the water.
The Surf Bathing Committee also had some useful suggestions, such as the provision of dressing sheds and life-saving aids.
Following the British tradition, bathing machines had been used on some Australian beaches. Later, they were replaced by tents and rough beach sheds used as changing rooms. These were now superseded by council-run public dressing sheds, which overcame the threat to decorum posed by people changing into their costumes on the beach. In Melbourne, private bathing boxes were allowed and persist today, protected from the ravages of progress by the Brighton Bathing Box Association.
It was at this time that Australia pioneered the bathing beauty film. T.J. West made Sydney's Sirens of the Surf, featuring mermaids from Manly, beauties from Bondi, and charmers from Coogee.
Bathing beauties were also incorporated into the patriotic feature The Enemy Within, starring Australian swimming champion Snowy Baker. Its heroine wore a somewhat conservative neck-to-knee costume with stockings and surf boots as well as an ornate rubber cap. 1915 saw surfboard riding introduced to Australia by the Hawaiian world swimming champion Duke Kahanamoku. Australia's first surfboard rider was a teenage girl.
I always wore a short bathing suit, and this is the one I was called immoral for wearing, and I should be hooted off the beach by the matrons of Cronulla. And there was a man in Cronulla who was supposed to be the catch of Cronulla, a very wealthy man. He heard one of the mothers say she should be hooted off the beach, you know, a costume, she's so immoral. So he publicly gave his dressing gown to Claude to cover my nakedness.
Despite such opposition, the shorter swimsuit proved exceedingly popular and was soon worn throughout Australia.
You've nothing against sex. When the summer comes along, everyone is gay. Down here by the seaside, you see them every day. Everyone is happy, not a thought of care. And all the bathing costumes will make you stand and stare. There are Green ones, mean ones, and variegated shades. Short ones, just 4 to 1s, and long ones for all maids. Swinging ones, clinging ones, the regular nectarine. Inspired ones and hired ones, a real calamity. Well, fed ones in red ones look like a drifting boy. New ones and blue ones, the wowsers most annoy. Slight ones in tight ones, as merry as a song. You find down at the seaside when the summer comes along.
The jazz age of the 1920s saw beaches more popular than ever. Beach accessories now included beach umbrellas, beach wraps, kimonos, and the ever-popular deck chairs.
The laws prohibiting loitering on the beach clad in bathing costume were now ignored as people came to spend all day on the beach.
The Jazz Age saw the bulky silhouette of earlier women's swimsuits replaced by a slender, streamlined, brightly coloured costume. It served to emphasise the newly fashionable boyish shape and indeed looked increasingly like male swimsuits.
By the late 20s, you start to get the development of sunbathing in a mass sense. It really hasn't been all that popular before. A lot of the public still really did think it was just loitering on the beach.
Sunbathing was now declared fashionable by Parisian couturier Coco Chanel, and also good for health by those promoting the physical fitness craze imported from Europe. Calisthenics and physical games also became popular among bathers, with the beach no longer just a place for swimming.
Women drew attention to their slender shapes by wearing elastic-ribbed woolen, cashmere or cotton costumes. The designers, delighted by the potential for innovation these new swimsuits gave them, covered them with Art Deco symbols, among them squares, circles, triangles and chevrons to dazzling effect.
Rubber caps remained popular, but stockings and shoes had been banished from the beach to be replaced by open sandals. The beach belt remained a fashionable accessory, which gradually became incorporated into the costume design. In 1928, the American swimwear giant Janssen established a factory in Australia, while at the same time the Australian McRae knitting mills began the manufacture of their soon famous Speedo costume. The V's men had worn over their costumes now disappeared inside, while trunks with singlet tops were introduced, a fashion that was soon to have dramatic repercussions.
The fitness and health craze gave rise to the search for the perfect Australian woman. She was found in 1927 in the person of Beryl Mills, our very first Miss Australia. Beryl paraded in the fashionable swimwear of the day, as indeed had Miss Australia done until the 1970s, when the rise of women's lib rendered such blatant displays of female flesh obsolete.
In the 1930s, women's costumes were tighter and more revealing. In 1934, this backless number caused a sensation.
With women's costumes backless, men's costumes followed suit, as shoulder straps were now reduced to thin strips. Beach culture now symbolise the Australian way of life, with beach scenes used to promote Australia abroad, and beach architecture, as seen here at Bondi, claimed to rival the resorts of the Riviera.
Another of the Riviera influences was that sunbathing became more popular, but some Walesers in the community didn't approve of this new form of French licentiousness. In fact, the New South Wales Minister for Local Government, Spooner, decided to insist that men should continue to wear tops on the beach. In fact, he earned the nickname Wear More Wool Spooner because he thought that Australian men ought to be forced to keep their tops covered.
There was such modesty prevailing everywhere at the time, even then, that if a person had a costume on and you rolled the shoulder straps down, he asked you to leave the beach if you rolled it down to your waist, you see. So you had to pull the shoulder straps up or get off the beach.
Jansen came up with a costume for men which had a zip-off top, so that on those beaches the topless bathing was allowed, they would take the top off.
And I can vividly recall the first bloke that had enough cheek to come down here and parade on the beach with a pair of trunks. A woman came to us very cowed, as a matter of fact, complained there's a fella over the beach over here and he's got nothing on the top of him. He's only got a pair of trunks on. And I just laughingly said, yes, you know, it doesn't look bad, does it?
But like many other changes in attitudes to dress regulation on Australian beaches, civil disobedience again won out, and by